All right. Well, let's jump into it. Introduction to anger management, the popularity of anger management. You know, Aristotle famously is quoted for anybody can become angry, that's easy, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that's not always within everybody's power, and that's not easy. So, just a quick question. How many results do you think a Google search would yield for anger? Just curious. Who wants to just throw it out there? 1,000? Million? 500? 500 million? Well, really quick, 865 million came up within 0.54 seconds. When I went to PsycInfo and Psych Articles search on Eric, warranted 34,000. I downloaded 545 peer-reviewed articles and a lot of material, using over probably 250 in this presentation alone. And then in pop culture, anger management's the title of a popular television series with Charlie Sheen. Maybe some folks have seen that. A movie with Jack Nicholson and Adam Sandler, and then also a title of a musical tour with Eminem. So we know that there's a lot out there. And there's an enormous amount of advice, right? But the problem is not all of it's founded on empirical evidence, and some of it is also based on misinformation or old information, which we'll kind of cover today as well. Popularity of anger as a topic. Time magazine, June 2016. America's anger is out of control. Anger is the lazy person's emotion. It's quick, it's binary, it's delicious, and more we're gorging on it. Washington Post, 2015. Roughly 22 million Americans, they're estimating, 8.9% of the adult population, have impulsive anger issues, as well as easy access to guns. 3.7 million of these angry gun owners routinely carry guns in public. Esquire magazine, NBC News, 2016. Those who report feeling angry a few times a day are considered angrier than those who report feeling angry once a day, who are angrier than those who get angry once a week, and so forth. Shall we see how anger has a cascading effect as well. Forbes magazine, CNN poll, how angry people are about the way things are going in the country today. 31% describe themselves as very angry, 37% somewhat. And we saw that women's anger was more intense than men's, which we'll cover as well as we get into this. 37% of women in 2017 compared to 25% of men. CBS News, 2016, a new poll finds that 49% of Americans say they're angrier more often than they used to be over current events and the news. And white Americans are feeling the most anger, 54% feel this way, compared to lower rates for other folks, which is interesting because we're also going to talk a little bit about the connection between entitlement and privilege and anger. 2014, a study found that anger, both overt and suppressed, is actually a common sign of mental health conditions. Psychologists suggest that people have difficulties coping with their anger at risk for developing depression. So that's not the first time we've heard that, but there's more and more research now quantifying those connections. Extra points here. Anybody can name the celebrities here who are expressing anger or violence in these cases? That's what's his name? Alec Baldwin? Courtney Love? Sharapova? Yeah, the tennis player? Yep. So when it comes to trying to quantify anger, it's hard to quantify that, right? It's just kind of like suicidality. It's kind of hard to quantify some of those domains. We found that a large number of people experience anger. And anger, as we're going to look at, can be healthy and at times unhealthy. So we're going to look at folks that are using anger in various ways and how that anger is used. We do know that statistically, and remember, we're in a profession here where we're disproportionately exposed to tough things, right? Which means we can start to shift our own worldview accidentally. And the reality is still estimated that less than 10% involve physical aggression, even though that rate may feel higher to us because we deal so much with folks that express that anger in unhealthy ways. We know that anger is experienced more frequently than other emotions. It lasts longer than other emotional states. It produces this strong tendency to approach, this approach motivation, which we're going to cover a little bit later as well, which is the opposite of fear, by the way. Fear tends to resolve in retreat. So you've got fight or flight. Fight's that moving forward. The flight is moving away from, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And it includes this experience of power. There's a large tie of power and morality. A lot of times anger is characterized by antagonism towards this concept of somebody or something or an organization or event or situation that somehow did me wrong. And like I mentioned, it can be a good thing because in some ways it can actually help us express our feelings and sometimes affect social change, sometimes stand up or advocate for ourselves. It's also essential. Martin Seligman, folks are probably familiar with his work, Gottman. Folks have found that successful relationships actually are not ones that are free from conflict, but are ones that actually do have anger, but they're able to successfully work through that. So it actually is an important part of our relationships, oddly enough. It's probably one of the most debated basic emotions, and this may be owed to difficulties in detecting its appearance during development. In fact, the more we kind of look at anger these next 2 days, I'm hoping you'll start to see the subtle nuances. For example, cynicism can be a form of anger. There's a variety of expressions of anger that a lot of times we don't classically think of as anger. And it can be highly detrimental, but it can also be highly empowering, and therefore there's a lot of mixed, there's kind of a mixed approach to that, a mixed idea of who should be angry and how and when we should be angry. We know that the experience of anger is described as this emotional reaction to that threat, like I mentioned before, and it's oftentimes experiencing something unpleasant that's obstructed reaching somebody's goals. And there's a fairness component to that, which we'll get into with that morality part. And there's this concept of blame. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Brene Brown, but she talks about a culture of blame, right, in her talk about vulnerability. And it really ties into that, I think, rather nicely. We know that, like shame, because Brene works on shame, and we're going to talk about some of the connections with shame and anger as well, that like shame, anger is conceptualized as a social emotion. And it's contextualized amongst our socialization. It's not necessarily something that's innate. What are emotions? Emotional processes, as you know, I'm going to skip through this because we kind of understand emotions, but we know that they are hardwired to our brain, and they're in a different part of our brain, as we're going to get into in the neuroscience side, than some of our other, especially cognition, some of the other aspects of our psyche. Some describe anger as this cover emotion, but there really isn't any evidence. In fact, I've heard in the room secondary emotion too, right, this idea. But there really isn't any evidence that it's not its own standalone emotion. And really, maybe a more accurate description might be anger seldom rides alone, right? That anger oftentimes is accompanied or connected with other emotions. We know that emotions are distributed over the entire person. Certain locations are regularly associated with emotional functioning. And we're going to talk about the amygdala and hippocampus and some of the other aspects of the sympathetic nervous system. The amygdala, hippocampus, and periaqueductal gray areas of the brain, which are most involved with the overall anger response. And we'll get into that in the neuroscience section. Potter Efron, do you guys know him? Have you read his book? 2005. This is probably still one of the more commonly used books for anger management. So you're going to see some stuff from some of his work. But he describes anger management as going through this paradigm shift, and that this current paradigm, or at least in the past, is really focused on male aggression. However, this really doesn't address some of the other forms of anger. For example, female batters, verbal aggression, and emotional manipulation, despite that physical aggression. And it doesn't include anger aggressors that are more connected to feelings of powerlessness and helplessness, those who use anger and aggression as entertainment, unfortunately, and those who struggle with attachment problems due to personal distress. So he talks about we're kind of looking at anger differently as we broaden our approach to treatment. The social media effect. Who's on Facebook? Oh, you're brave. We know that unprocessed anger can pollute the social sphere, as you've seen. And every outburst has this, again, cascading effect that can legitimize the next. So it really does become almost this reverberation chamber, almost like mass hysteria. And now that we have this technology, it can perpetuate it. And as we know, like cyberbullying versus in-person bullying, bullying in person, you're on the playground, it's a recess or whatever, you've got a 60-minute window to have to cope and deal with, and then I can go back to my safe zone. Cyberbullying's 24 hours a day, right? Also, you don't have control to the access. You don't have control to make change a lot of times. Same type of situation with the social media effect around anger. So we know that venting unmediated fury for political effect can really, it's also very provocative, right? There's an exhilaration for a lot of folks. And there's a sense of power. Certainly this image of power isn't any more timely than the present when it comes to our leader of the country, probably, right? So talking about that anger bandwagon effect, someone expresses it, then it drives someone else to express it as well. And thanks to Facebook, we've got this, like I said, this big kind of cascading effect where folks can get this righteous thrill of expressed rage. And that's the key there, this moral righteousness, this sense that I'm somehow making change or I'm somehow making a difference by expressing myself with anger. When it comes to good and bad anger, good anger may be useful in order, like I said, to maintain personal boundaries. So if somebody crosses you, gets in your space, insults you, touches you, or does something in your sphere, then you can kind of say, hey, I'm angry, I'm going to express this, and you can use that as a healthy feature. The complicating feature of social media is that someone might be stepping on our identity or belief system because we offer this so plentiful on the web, right? But we don't realize that as well. Now, when you're interacting one-on-one with somebody in a relational, in-person kind of singular present moment, you have this chance to read their body language, to kind of get that interaction, get a sense of how that's being received. But when you're broadcasting, it's a different realm, right? And you can inadvertently be offending lots of people who otherwise maybe you wouldn't have, or vice versa. Like any stimulant, anger can have addictive properties. You become habituated, and you start to kind of rove around looking for other things to make you angry. Almost like the same effect I like to use to describe that is the suspicion. I don't know if anybody works with couples, but as soon as it's been discovered that there's been a breach of trust, then that partner becomes Sherlock Holmes, and they're constantly looking for it. And what it does is it creates this feeling that there's still other stuff, right? It creates this feeling that bad things are still happening even if they're not. That same kind of concept. Like I mentioned too, there's this illusion of power. I mean, look at the Incredible Hulk. When you look at the Avengers, there's almost an unspoken reverence given to the Hulk versus all the rest of those very powerful superheroes, right? I mean, even the superheroes are scared of Hulk. So there's somehow a concept here that this is the guy we have to be who's the most powerful in some way. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. That's his common catchphrase. So in what ways does our human socialization, do you think, affect our anger? As I mentioned, it is a socialized emotion. Who wants to take a stab? What we grow up seeing, absolutely. What we're exposed to. Cumulative culture, where I'm trying to blend in and connect? Is that what you mean?
Like the difference maybe.
Okay.
There's a real gender difference. I feel like part of our socialization as men embraces anger as a manly quality to have, but for women it's just the opposite.
Gender codification around anger, no doubt about it. With men, there's this concept of virility and power, right? And really the only socially acceptable emotion probably for a man to express is anger in some ways. And we talk about that when I do couples work. I'm like, I know that a lot of times that's that myth, that's that idea. Because anything else somehow connotes weakness or somehow doesn't associate you with this strength concept that is associated with male. I mean, we're starting to see some of that shift, right? But those traditional scripts, at least, of gender binary norm, that has a lot of times driven that idea.
Where our culture, I think, is so immediate. We want everything immediately. So I think sometimes the anger comes from not being able to get what we want when we want it. And the impatience leads to anger.
So this world of instant and immediate, it becomes an expectation, right? The sense of entitlement. And then sometimes it then perpetuates this idea of anger because I'm not getting it the way I thought.
I think there's just a lot of unresolved trauma from like things like racism, homophobia,
Right.
evilism, and like a lot of sort of mystification and gaslighting around those who have like privilege and those who don't. So I think that's just a very specific way of socializing sort of unformulated anger.
So anger is a reaction to minority stress in some way, right? So around homophobia, racism, ableism, in other ways that have then created this, and gaslighting, as he mentions, which is the concept of making the other person seem as if they're not seeing things clearly when they're trying to reflect that back to that individual. Yeah. Any other ways you can think of? Those are all good. So anger socially cues others to get away from that angry person. So there's that kind of that fear response, right, that we're seeing. Anger expression facilitates avoidance-related behavior in the observers, but fear expression facilitates approach behaviors in the perceiver of who's creating the anger. This is that approach motivation, and we're going to get more in depth with that in a minute. You're going to see a lot of themes in this presentation, by the way, kind of repeated over and over, because I'm kind of trying to drive home some of these ideas. So we also know that it's tied to culture. Anybody a Bronfenbrenner or social ecology person? I mean, are you familiar with that idea? So there's big culture with a capital C, but then there's culture with a little c, which is more of this social ecology of those around us, this meso, macro, micro system of folks around us. So that can include everything from our family, our neighborhood, all of these other different influences that can really create our culture, which then can shape how anger is expressed. We do know that anger can also in some ways be contagious. It can be an emotional contagion. And a large part of that is due to the mimicking response of our social interaction. Big thing we're going to drive home in the presentation is that anger is often rooted in these corrective intentions, that I somehow need to do something about this in order to either prevent it from happening again, prevent it from happening to somebody else, to make change, to somehow right a wrong. And it's rooted in a lot of feelings around disrespect, unfairness, disappointment, violation, wronged, those kinds of things. So all those oftentimes would fall in that moral category. And also very subjective category, right? And oftentimes misunderstood or misinterpreted categories. So anger is rooted in this desire to self-protect. And I think that's the key that I'm trying to drive home here. People are trying to do the right thing when they become angry. But it's not working out that way because we don't live in the kind of world that we needed that kind of response to, that primordial response to, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well as we get into the neuroscience. So we know that the characteristics of angry families, that contagion part, that mimicking part, can really affect the child. In fact, I've got a client right now that I'm working with who just really feels broken or burdened by his generative anger in his family system, his mother, his brother, their grandparents before that. And you can really see, especially when you use a genogram and kind of break this out, you can really see how anger has impacted their family system in such an amazing way. So we know that angry families oftentimes have at least one or more parent who often expresses anger, and a child as well. And there's that mom-son concept I was mentioning with my client. Anger dominates a lot of times over other emotions within the family system. There's a norm, right? Just like with other maladaptive responses, there's a norm in the family system that then becomes familiar and comfortable, and folks can be drawn to that. So therefore you see folks maybe with struggles in their relationships because one person feels like they're constantly wanting to argue or bicker, but in some ways it might be because they're drawn towards that as part of what's relatable. There's also a lot of times this idea that people won't listen to me until I become angry, so it's a way to get attention, it's a way to designate leadership in the family. Even family members teach or solve other problems through anger, like I talked about, sarcasm, cynicism, even what's not spoken, contempt. Those can all be forms of anger that are used in teaching ways through criticism. and certainly entrenched in that culture of blame.